From debt to devotion, how she won the heart of a gay billionaire. Hey there, beautiful souls. Welcome to Love Crib, your ultimate destination for all things romance, connection, and heartfelt stories. I'm thrilled to have you here, sharing this amazing journey of exploring love in all its beautiful, complex, and magical forms. Whether you're a hopeless romantic, someone searching for relationship insights, or just love diving into heartwarming content, you're exactly where you need to be. If you're enjoying what you see, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could. Hit that subscribe button to stay connected with our Love Crib community. Drop a like to show some love, support, and motivation. Share this video with someone who might need a little romance in their life. Your support means the world to me and helps us continue creating content that celebrates love, connection, and the beautiful stories that bring us together. Nina Hawkins never imagined that the pressures of life could manifest so brutally in a single winter's day. Every morning, as she trudged through the gray streets of her small hometown, the burden of her mother Evelyn's mounting medical bills pressed heavily upon her shoulders. The worn soles of her shoes bore silent testimony to the many miles she walked, each one taken in desperate hope of a solution that never came. At the modest kitchen table of their weathered home, Nina would sit with a lukewarm cup of tea and a stack of overdue notices. The numbers danced before her eyes, a relentless arithmetic of debt that threatened to swallow them whole. Evelyn, once a vivacious woman known for her infectious laugh and sparkling blue eyes, now wore a constant mask of weariness. The illness that had debilitated her for years left her frail, and the cost of her treatments grew higher with each passing month. Nina's heart ached every time she watched her mother's pain, knowing that despite her tireless efforts, there was little she could do to ease the financial strain. Every letter delivered by the postman felt like a ticking time bomb. The hospital bills, the medications, and the daily expenses, all of them piled up relentlessly. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was still shrouded in a pale haze, Nina would pace the creaking wooden floors of their modest apartment. Thoughts of an uncertain future haunted her. She recalled the days when her mother's laughter filled her small living room, a sound that could lift the gloom of even the darkest evening. But those days now belonged to a different past, a time when hope was abundant, and the future promised little more than a comfortable, ordinary life. Now, every decision carried the weight of a world that seemed determined to crush her spirit. One chilly morning, while Nina sifted through another heap of bills, the sound of a knock startled her. Peering through the frosted window, she saw a sharply dressed man whose presence contrasted starkly with the bleakness of her surroundings. The man introduced himself as an attorney representing a powerful corporation. He explained, in no uncertain terms, that her family's unpaid debts were not only a private matter, but it caught the attention of influential people. The ultimatum was clear: pay a vast sum of money immediately, or face a legal battle that would likely strip them of everything they owned. For Nina, this encounter crystallized the terror of her situation. In that moment of despair, her mind raced through every possible escape route. It was then that an unexpected call arrived. The number was unfamiliar, and with trembling hands, she answered. A calm, measured voice introduced itself as Dominic Ashford, a name that would soon change the course of her life. Dominic was not a man who typically made small talk. Instead, he spoke directly about the predicament that had forced him to step in. With a hint of pragmatic compassion, he explained that he understood the burden of debt, albeit from a vastly different perspective. Dominic's offer was as shocking as it was audacious. He proposed a marriage of convenience. His explanation was matter-of-fact. As a high-profile CEO whose public image was vital for satisfying a board of investors and maintaining a carefully handpicked family legacy, he needed a wife, a partner for public appearances. More importantly, he was in a situation where his own personal life had become an open secret. Being openly gay, Dominic faced intense scrutiny from his family and the business world alike. A social wife would serve as a shield, protecting him from unwelcome questions and preserving the illusion of conformity. For Nina, whose life had been reduced to endless calculations of bills and impossible choices, this proposal was a lifeline. The terms of the arrangement were startlingly generous. In exchange for her agreement to pose as his wife at various social functions, Dominic would see to it that Evelyn's medical debts were entirely forgiven. In addition, he would provide a substantial monthly allowance, secure ongoing medical care for her ailing mother, and even transfer the deed of their modest home directly to Evelyn's name. And after 5 years, when the charade was no longer necessary, the marriage would be legally dissolved with considerable settlement to ensure that Nina's sacrifices were never forgotten. Nina's initial reaction was a tumult of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a glimmer of hope all intermingled. The notion of marrying a man she had never met, of entering into a contract that seemed as surreal as a fairy tale, was daunting. Yet the promise of stability, of finally freeing her mother from the relentless grip of debt, ignited a cautious spark within her heart. That very night, as rain battered the window and shadows danced in the lamplight, Nina weighed her options. The decision was not one she took lightly. It was a pact with fate, a desperate gamble in a game where the stakes were nothing less than survival. She recalled the tender memories of childhood, days spent in sunlit fields, moments of laughter with her mother that now seemed like relics of another lifetime. But those memories, as precious as they were, did little to stave off the cold reality of the present. The walls of their home, once adorned with pictures and mementos, now served as silent witnesses to the creeping despair that had taken root. And so, with a heavy heart and trembling resolve, Nina consented to the arrangement. She signed the papers in a small, sterile office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. With each stroke of the pen, she felt both a measure of relief and a gnawing apprehension, a sense that she was stepping into a life that was as uncertain as it was opulent. Thus began a journey that would transform every facet of Nina's existence. As she stepped out of that nondescript office, a surreal mix of hope and resignation washed over her. In that singular moment, the desperate pleas of a daughter and the cold calculations of a powerful man converged. Nina Hawkins had traded one form of captivity for another, one gilded by promises of wealth and security, but shadowed by the relentless question, at what cost does salvation come? The day faded into a blur of conflicting emotions. Outside, the city moved on indifferently, its busy streets unaware of the silent sacrifice unfolding within a single modest apartment. Nina's thoughts churned as she made her way home, a mosaic of memories, fears, and reluctant hope. Every step carried the weight of responsibility. Every breath a silent vow to secure a better future for her mother. Even as the bitter chill of reality seeped into her bones, the promise of a life unburdened by financial ruin glimmered faintly on the horizon. In the quiet solitude of her room that night, Nina stared at the documents spread out on her small desk. The ink was still fresh, the legal jargon a stark reminder of the transformation she had just embraced. As the wind howled outside, echoing her inner turmoil, she whispered a promise into the darkness, that no matter how uncertain the future, she would endure. In the midst of despair, a fragile hope had taken root, and even the bleakest winter promised potential for a new dawn. The following weeks unfolded like a fever dream. The town's familiar rhythms now seemed interspersed with events that were entirely foreign to Nina. She found herself pulled into a whirlwind of legal meetings, document signings, and anxious phone calls. Every day brought news of court summons and the lingering threat of lawsuits from creditors who were growing impatient. The relentless pressure weighed on her, and even the smallest sound, a creak in a hallway or the distant murmur of conversation, seemed to echo with the impending threat of disaster. Dominic Ashford, the man behind the unconventional proposal, was a study in contrasts. In public, he maintained an impeccable composure, exuding the quiet authority expected of a successful CEO. Yet, privately, he was a man burdened by the duality of his existence. His life, meticulously curated to appease investors and family alike, was a constant balancing act between authenticity and obligation. Though his public persona was polished and controlled, the private moments, rare and fleeting, revealed the loneliness and isolation that came with a life lived behind a carefully constructed facade. During their initial meeting in a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline, Dominic laid out the details of the arrangement with disarming frankness. He explained his board had grown restless over his personal matters, and his family, particularly his formidable mother Beatrice, had begun to whisper disapproval behind closed doors. Dominic's tone was devoid of any sentimentality, as if discussing an ordinary business transaction rather than the merging of lives. This arrangement, he stated, is not about love or passion. It is a calculated strategy to secure the stability of my company and my legacy. In return, you will receive protection and support for your mother that no conventional loan or charity could ever provide." Nina listened intently, her heart pounding in her ears as the enormity of the situation settled over her like a heavy shroud. She recognized the cold logic behind his words. Here was a man who, despite his affluence, was ensnared by the expectations of society and the unyielding demands of a legacy he did not choose. And yet, within the clinical presentation of his proposal, there existed an undercurrent of compassion. Dominic was offering her a chance at liberation from the shackles of debt, a promise that her mother would be cared for in a way that transcended mere financial transactions. In the days that followed, Nina found herself oscillating between hope and despair. The contract that bound her to Dominic was both a lifeline and a chain. Every clause was carefully worded, its legalese a reminder that her freedom had a price. Over countless cups of tea in a cramped law office, she reviewed the details with a trusted attorney. They spoke in hushed tones about the intricacies of prenuptial agreements and the potential pitfalls of a union based on convenience. Despite her attorney's cautious warnings about the long-term implications of such an arrangement, Nina's resolve only hardened. The thought of her mother's suffering, of seeing the vibrant woman she once knew reduced to a shadow of herself, was a fate she could not abide. Outside the sterile walls of the law office, the world carried on in ignorant bliss. Friends and neighbors continued with their daily routines, blissfully unaware that one of their own was about to enter into a life-altering pact. In quiet moments of introspection, Nina grappled with the moral ambiguity of her decision. She questioned whether sacrificing the possibility of true love was worth the promise of security, and whether the life she was about to lead would rob her of her identity. Yet, as each new bill arrived and each phone call from a creditor grew more insistent, the answer became painfully clear. There was no alternative. Dominic's insistence on expediency left little room for hesitation. He demanded that the paperwork be finalized within a matter of weeks, a deadline that added an additional layer of urgency to Nina's already frayed nerves. Every evening, as she sat by the dim light of her bedside lamp, she would pore over the contract's pages. The legal obligations, the specific sums, the detailed provisions, all of it was a stark reminder that her future was now tethered to a man she barely knew. And yet, in the quiet spaces between the lines, there lay an unspoken promise. The promise of a debt free from the crushing weight of overdue bills, and the promise of a secure haven for her mother. As the deadline approached, Nina began to feel the inexorable pull of fate. The decision, once a desperate necessity, was now a permanent fixture of her destiny. The realization was as bitter as it was liberating. She recalled the tender smile of her mother, Evelyn's face lit by hope during better times, and knew that she could no longer allow financial ruin to extinguish that light. The ultimatum had been delivered in a tone of finality, leaving no room for negotiation. And so, with a final nod to the inevitability of her situation, Nina embraced the path laid before her. On a rain-soaked afternoon, as droplets raced down the window panes of Quiet Cafe, Nina met Dominic once more. The meeting was brief, yet every word exchanged carried the weight of irrevocable commitment. Their conversation was clinical, stripped of any warmth, as they reviewed the final details of the arrangement. Dominic's eyes, usually so guarded, revealed a fleeting glimmer of sympathy, a silent acknowledgement of the personal cost this deal would exact. For his part, Nina offered no protest. Her voice was steady as she recited her understanding of the terms. In that somber moment, the finality of the contract was sealed, and a new chapter of her life began, a chapter that promised salvation, but also carried the seeds of inevitable sacrifice. As Nina stepped out into the chill of the late afternoon, the rain mingled with the tears she dared not shed. Every droplet that fell from the sky felt like a benediction and a curse, a reminder that even in the midst of despair, there existed a possibility of renewal. The future, uncertain and fraught with challenges, lay before her like an uncharted map. And though the path was steeped in shadows, the promise of a debt-free tomorrow lent her the strength to continue. With each determined step toward the unknown, Nina Hawkins accepted her fate, a fate that was now inextricably entwined with that of Dominic Ashford, the man who had offered her a chance at redemption in a world that had long forsaken her. The days following that rain-soaked meeting blurred together into a mosaic of legal formalities and hushed whispers. In the sterile corridors of law firms and financial institutions, Nina found herself thrust into an unfamiliar world, a realm where every handshake sealed a deal and every signature bound her closer to a destiny she had never chosen. The proposition that Dominic had offered was simple in its structure, yet profound in its implications. It was an agreement that would reshape not only her daily existence, but also the very fabric of her identity. At the heart of the arrangement was a promise. The cancellation of her mother's suffocating debts, a generous monthly allowance to cover living expenses, and an assurance that Evelyn's medical care would be maintained at the highest standard. Perhaps most symbolic of all was the transfer of the deed of their humble home to Evelyn's name, a tangible recognition of protection being granted. And looming on the horizon, after 5 years of public appearances and carefully orchestrated events, would come the divorce, a legal separation that, in theory, would restore Nina's autonomy along with substantial financial settlement. Yet as the contract was laid out before her, its fine print shimmering under the fluorescent lights of the conference room, Nina could not help but feel a sense of disquiet. There was an inherent coldness in the clinical language of the document, a stark reminder that the union was nothing more than a business transaction. Dominic's conditions were unyielding, and every clause was designed to protect his interests as much as it promised salvation for hers. The agreement was meticulously crafted to ensure that neither party could later claim any emotional obligation. Love, trust, and companionship were conspicuously absent. What remained was a carefully engineered facade of marital bliss. In private moments, Nina wrestled with the enormity of the sacrifice. The thought of stepping into a role that was as much a costume as it was a contract unsettled her. Yet, when she looked at the fragile figure of her mother, whose health had deteriorated under the relentless pressure of unpaid bills, Nina knew that no personal misgivings could outweigh the necessity of the deal. Her mother's well-being was paramount, and the promise of financial security provided a glimmer of hope that, for the first time in years, there might be a future free from the constant specter of bankruptcy. Dominic, for his part, maintained a dispassionate professionalism that bordered on the clinical. In his spacious, modern office adorned with minimalist art and panoramic views of the city skyline, he explained the practicalities of the arrangement. "We both have much to gain from this," he said in a measured tone. "My family's expectations and the demands of the business leave little room for personal complications. In return, you will have every resource you need to care for your mother, and you will never have to worry about the burden of debt again." His words, though stripped of any overt sentiment, carried the weight of pragmatic finality. As the days turned into nights filled with endless consultations and revisions to the contract, Nina began to see the arrangement as a lifeline rather than a shackle. Late evenings found her poring over legal documents at the small wooden desk in her room, the soft hum of the desk lamp the only companion to her thoughts. Each paragraph, each clause, was scrutinized and memorized, a ritualistic act of acceptance. In those moments of solitary reflection, she would remind herself of the stakes, the promise of a debt-free life, the security of her mother's future, and the hope that someday, perhaps, she might reclaim a part of herself that had been sacrificed for survival. Yet amid the legal minutiae and the clinical negotiations, a subtle undercurrent of uncertainty persisted. Nina wondered what it would mean to live a life that was defined entirely by obligation, a series of public appearances, carefully staged events, and an unending performance for an audience that cared little for the truth. The reality of becoming a social wife was daunting, and the prospect of spending years in a relationship where the intimate details were governed by contracts rather than genuine affection filled her with a quiet dread. In conversation with her attorney, Nina learned that many such arrangements, while legally sound, left lasting scars on those who entered them. "You must be prepared," her lawyer warned gently, "for the emotional cost of living a life that is not truly your own." Those words echoed in Nina's mind as she signed the final page of the contract, a symbolic act that bound her to a future of calculated appearances and measured emotions. Outside, the world continued its indifferent march. Neighbors exchanged pleasantries on sunlit sidewalks, and life's simple routines went on as if untouched by the dark intricacies unfolding in the backrooms of corporate power. For Nina, every new day was a reminder of the choices she had made, the sacrifice she had rendered in the name of duty and love. And though the proposition promised relief from the relentless financial strain, it also demanded that she surrender pieces of herself to a role that was as transient as it was prescribed. By the time the ink dried on the final copy of the agreement, Nina had already begun to internalize the magnitude of her decision. She recognized that the road ahead would be paved with moments of public celebration and private sorrow, with days when the weight of the contract would press down on her heart like an unyielding chain. Yet even in that acknowledgement, there was a kernel of resolve, a determination to see the arrangement through, if only to secure a future for her mother and, perhaps, to reclaim her own dignity in a world that had long denied her both. As dusk settled over the city on the day of the contract's finalization, Nina sat quietly by the window of her modest apartment. The fading light cast long shadows on the floor, mirroring the duality of her own existence, a life divided between desperate necessity and the uncertain promise of redemption. With a final, trembling exhale, she accepted the terms of the proposition. In that moment, the legal document became more than ink on paper. It was a covenant between hope and sacrifice, a pact that would shape every facet of her future. And so, with the contract signed and the die irrevocably cast, Nina Hawkins stepped into a new chapter of her life, one that promised to be as beautiful as it was burdensome, as liberating as it was laced with regret. The path before her was fraught with complexities, but it was the only path that led away from the suffocating grip of debt. With each passing second, the promise of financial security and the hope for a better tomorrow mingled with the bittersweet taste of a choice made in desperation. In the sterile light of the courthouse's back chambers, the day of the official signing arrived. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of paper and the measured ticking of an old clock hanging on the wall. Here, amid solemn faces and the muted hum of legal formalities, Nina and Dominic met once again to finalize the details of their unconventional union. The contract was laid out on a large oak table, its pages crisp and its terms unyielding. Every word was deliberate, a carefully drawn boundary between the realms of public duty and private longing. Nina's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the pen that would bind her to a future she scarcely understood. The contract detailed not only the financial guarantees, her mother Evelyn's debts absolved, a generous monthly allowance, top-tier medical care, and the transfer of the house's deed, but also the less tangible aspects of their arrangement. There were clauses outlining the responsibilities expected at every public engagement, strict limits on personal interaction, and even detailed provisions regarding the eventual divorce that would free her from a union after 5 years. The language was cold and mechanical, every sentence constructed with the precision of a business deal rather than the tender nuances of marriage. Dominic, seated across from her in an impeccably tailored suit, maintained an air of calm detachment. His gaze, steady and unyielding, met hers as he recited the final terms. "This union," he said with measured clarity, "will serve its purpose to provide stability for both of us. You will be my wife in the public eye, and in return, you will have every assurance for your mother's well-being. The obligations are clear, and once the agreed term is passed, our legal ties will be dissolved with settlement that reflects the sacrifice you have made." Every word resonated in the silent room, the weight of each promise and condition seeping into the atmosphere. Nina listened, her thoughts a tempest of conflicting emotions. She recalled the long, sleepless nights spent poring over each clause, the whispered conversations with her attorney, and the quiet moments when the reality of the arrangement became almost too overwhelming to bear. Yet, beneath the turmoil, a steadfast resolve had taken root, a determination to endure the sacrifices demanded of her for the sake of her mother's future. In the moments that followed, the pen glided across the paper in deliberate strokes, sealing Nina's fate with a flourish of ink. The act was final, irreversible, a formalization of a union that was both a sanctuary and a prison. As the signature dried, Nina felt a strange amalgamation of relief and sorrow. Relief that at long last, the promise of financial salvation was secured. Sorrow that, in doing so, she had locked herself into a life dictated by contracts and public expectations. Outside the courthouse, the crisp autumn air seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the gravity of the day's events. Nina's mind wandered back to the countless letters, the mounting bills, and the silent pleas of a mother who had always put the needs of her daughter above her own. Now, With this contract, those burdens might finally be lifted. But the cost was not measured solely in dollars. It was a toll on her heart, a quiet resignation to the life she might have had if love and passion had been at the helm. Dominic's presence throughout the proceedings was both reassuring and unnerving. His efficiency in handling the legal formalities was matched only by his detached manner. Though his eyes occasionally betrayed a hint of empathy, his words remained firmly ensconced in businesslike precision. For him, this was merely a strategic maneuver, an arrangement designed to deflect scrutiny and secure the future of his corporate empire. Yet in that brief window of shared responsibility, there was an unspoken recognition that both parties were, in some way, sacrificing pieces of themselves. Later that afternoon, as Nina left the courthouse and stepped into a waiting car, her thoughts were a tumult of introspection. The city around her moved with the indifferent pace of life, each person absorbed in their own narrative, oblivious of profound transformation that had just taken place. In the quiet solitude of the ride home, Nina's eyes filled with tears she dared not shed in public. The contract was a double-edged sword, a promise of relief that came with the inexorable cost of her own autonomy. That night, in the soft glow of her bedroom lamp, Nina reread the contract one final time. Each line, each clause, echoed in the silent space around her. With a deep, shuddering breath, she whispered a promise to the darkness that no matter how the future unfolded, she would honor the sacrifice she had made, not out of resignation, but out of a fierce love for the woman who had raised her against all odds. In that quiet moment of resolve, the legal document became more than a piece of paper. It transformed into a symbol of both burden and hope, a tangible link between her present struggles and the promise of a debt-free future. And so, as midnight approached and the world outside slumbered, Nina Hawkins drifted into an uneasy sleep, a sleep filled with dreams of both liberation and loss. In the stillness of the night, the contract lay open on her desk, its words a constant reminder of the pact that would shape every moment of her life in the years to come. The day of the wedding dawned with a surreal mix of splendor and sorrow. The venue was a grand estate on the outskirts of the city, a stately mansion with manicured gardens and marble walkways that gleamed in the soft morning light. Despite the outward opulence, the air was thick with the tension of a union born of necessity rather than passion. For Nina, every detail of the day was a carefully choreographed performance in a play that she had never auditioned for but was now forced to star in. As she prepared in a spacious, elegantly decorated suite, Nina's reflection in the ornate mirror told a story of quiet resilience tinged with melancholy. The soft rustle of her gown and the gentle hum of the string quartet in the background did little to mask the swirling emotions inside her. Today was not a celebration of love, but rather a meticulously staged event designed to create the illusion of marital bliss, a necessary charade to satisfy the expectations of high society, investors, and a powerful family legacy. Dominic Ashford, the man with whom she was to share the stage, arrived punctually in a sleek black limousine. Dressed in a tailored suit that emphasized both authority and detachment, he exuded an air of practiced elegance. Though his public smile was impeccable, there was an undeniable chill in his demeanor, a reminder that beneath the surface, he too was entrapped by the constraints of a life built on appearances. At the brief glance they exchanged upon meeting, there was little warmth, a silent acknowledgment of the transaction they were about to perform. The ceremony itself was a carefully orchestrated affair. A renowned officiant recited the words of union with the detached solemnity of a legal document being read aloud. Guests, a mix of high society dignitaries, business magnates, and curious onlookers, watched with expressions that betrayed both admiration and speculation. Each moment was meticulously staged. The exchange of rings, the carefully timed vows that emphasized duty over emotion, and the final pronouncement of husband and wife, all of which were designed to project an image of stability and conformity. As Nina walked down the aisle, every step felt like a march toward an uncertain future. She tried to focus on the faces in the crowd, faces that radiated expectation, yet also pity. In the midst of the celebration, her thoughts drifted to her mother Evelyn, whose struggle had been the catalyst for this entire arrangement. The lavish decor, the sparkling chandeliers, and the gentle murmur of polite conversation were a stark contrast to the raw reality of the sacrifices she was making. After the ceremony, The reception began in a grand ballroom filled with laughter, music, and the clink of champagne glasses. While most guests reveled in the festivity, Nina moved like a shadow among the crowd. Her interactions were measured and polite, a performance as much as a personal coping mechanism. Every compliment and congratulatory remark felt rehearsed, and every congratulatory smile was a reminder that she was no longer simply Nina Hawkins. She was now a public figure, a piece in a larger corporate strategy. Between rounds of formal photographs and carefully timed speeches, Nina found herself momentarily alone on a balcony overlooking the expansive estate. The cool evening air brushed her cheeks as she gazed out at the twinkling lights of the distant city, a city that had promised her escape from poverty and, paradoxically, had ushered her into a gilded cage. In that brief moment of solitude, the reality of her situation crystallized. The wedding was not a beginning, but rather a continuation of a life dictated by obligations. Every smile, every toast, and every well-meaning remark was layered with the unspoken truth that she had sacrificed something invaluable. Dominic soon joined her on the balcony. His voice, measured and calm, broke the silence. "This day marks only the first step," he said softly. "We have a long road ahead, and while today is a celebration, it is also the start of a partnership that is built on mutual necessity." His words, though delivered with the precision of a business proposal, carried a weight that Nina could not ignore. In that fleeting moment, she saw not a man who loved her, but a man who, like her, was trapped by the confines of expectation and duty. Back inside the ballroom, the festivities continued well into the night. The reception was punctuated by meticulously arranged dances, speeches that extolled the virtues of family and legacy, and an undercurrent of whispers among the guests. While many marveled at the beauty of the ceremony, a few astute observers exchanged knowing glances, recognizing, perhaps, that beneath the veneer of celebration lay a story of sacrifice and sorrow. As the evening drew to a close, Nina found herself caught in the relentless swirl of public appearances and media scrutiny. Every step she took was photographed, every gesture analyzed. The extravagant wedding, designed to project an image of perfection, had inadvertently exposed the fragility of her inner world. While the world celebrated a union that promised stability, Nina's heart whispered quiet doubts about the cost of that stability. The promise of a secure future for her mother, the cancellation of all debts, and the assurance of ongoing care were indeed transformative. Yet, as she danced with Dominic and posed for countless photographs, she could not shake the feeling that she was performing in a play written by forces far beyond her control. The reception ended with a final round of applause and a cascade of sparkling confetti that slowly settled on the marble floors. In the aftermath of the celebration, as guests departed and the lights dimmed, Nina was left alone with her thoughts. The echoes of the day, of formalities observed and promises exchanged, reverberated in her mind. The wedding had been a dazzling spectacle, a moment in time when the external trappings of success obscured the emotional toll of the sacrifices made. And as she finally retired to her suite that night, the weight of her new reality pressed upon her like an unspoken promise that the true cost of salvation was yet to be fully revealed. In the weeks following the ceremony, Nina's life transformed into a series of meticulously orchestrated public appearances and events. Every day was a performance, a carefully choreographed display of affluence, poise, and conformity. The transformation from a woman burdened by debt to the wife of a high-profile CEO was complete in the eyes of the public. Yet behind the flawless facade lay a tumult of internal conflict and a sense of isolation that grew with every passing engagement. At business luncheons, charity galas, and exclusive social gatherings, Nina moved with the grace of someone who had long practiced the art of hiding her true self. Photographers captured every moment. Her radiant smile, her perfectly styled hair, the subtle glimmer of expensive jewelry. But in the quiet intervals between flashes, she longed for the anonymity of her former life. A life where every decision was her own and where love was measured not by public opinion, but by the warmth of honest emotion. Dominic remained a constant presence by her side at these events. Though he exuded confidence and control, his eyes often betrayed a distance that left Nina feeling like an accessory rather than a partner. His interactions were succinct, his responses curt. In the crowded rooms filled with the murmurs of influential figures, he rarely allowed his guard to drop. For Nina, Every smile he offered was polite but impersonal, a reminder that the union they shared was built on necessity rather than desire. As the months slipped by, the pressures of this public life began to chip away at Nina's resolve. Each high society event was a reminder of the role she was forced to play, a role that, while lucrative and protective for her mother, left her questioning the very essence of who she was becoming. There were quiet moments, in the stillness of a luxurious hotel room after a long day of appearances, when she allowed herself to wonder if the sacrifices she had made were worth the price of her personal freedom. In those moments, the gentle hum of the city outside became a lament for lost dreams, and the echo of her own heartbeat felt painfully solitary. One evening, after a charity dinner that had stretched into the early hours, Nina stood on the balcony of their penthouse suite, gazing at the neon lights that adorned the city skyline. The vibrant colors in constant motion seemed to mock the stillness that filled her heart. She thought of Evelyn, her mother, and the promise that had driven her to accept this life. In a quiet, introspective voice, she vowed that despite the sacrifices, she would hold on to hope that one day, this carefully constructed facade would give way to a life of genuine freedom and self-respect. Yet the reality of the arrangement was inescapable. The media began to take an avid interest in the mystery couple. Interviews were scheduled, and every public appearance became fodder for tabloid speculation. Rumors swirled about the nature of their relationship. Some whispered that Dominic's affection was as transactional as the contract that bound them, while others speculated that the arrangement was masking deeper secrets. In the midst of this relentless scrutiny, Nina felt increasingly exposed. The very act of being in the public eye, of having every gesture dissected, eroded the remnants of privacy that she had once known. At one particularly lavish gala, while the room buzzed with conversation about business mergers and philanthropic endeavors, Nina found herself retreating into a quiet corner. The laughter and clinking of glasses were a distant murmur compared to the cacophony of doubts echoing in her mind. In that moment of solitude, she realized that while the arrangement had rescued her from financial ruin, it had also isolated her from the very essence of life. The cost of security was her identity, a price that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Despite these inner turmoils, the benefits of the arrangement were undeniable. Evelyn's health improved significantly thanks to uninterrupted access to world-class medical care. The looming threat of foreclosure was erased by the transfer of the house's deed, and the monthly allowance provided Nina with the means to live in comfort, if not happiness. Yet every financial gain was counterbalanced by an emotional loss that cut deeper than any monetary debt ever could. Dominic, ever the consummate professional, continued to navigate his public duties with a detached grace. Yet occasionally, in the quiet recesses of his office or in stolen moments away from prying eyes, there were hints of vulnerability, a fleeting look in the mirror, a pause before a difficult phone call. These moments, though rare, suggested that the man behind the well-polished exterior was also paying a price for the sacrifices demanded by his dual life. Still, for Nina, the distance between them only deepened her sense of isolation, reinforcing the belief that while their union might secure her mother's future, it left her own heart locked away behind a facade of duty and decorum. As autumn yielded to winter, the season of public appearances turned into a blur of snow-dusted gala events and brisk outdoor engagements. In the midst of it all, Nina clung to the promise that each event was a stepping stone toward the eventual dissolution of the union, a future where the contract would expire, and she might reclaim the autonomy that had been lost. But until that distant day arrived, she was forced to navigate a life lived entirely on display, a life where every smile was measured, every gesture rehearsed, and every interaction tinged with a bittersweet taste of sacrifice. In the ensuing months, as the initial shock of the arrangement began to fade into a steady rhythm of public obligations, cracks slowly appeared in the carefully constructed facade of Nina's new life. Late at night, in the silent corridors of her expansive apartment, she would sit alone, the city's distant lights serving as a stark reminder of all that she had given up. The toll of maintaining appearances began to manifest in quiet moments of vulnerability. In the solitude of her private world, Nina's mind would wander to what might have been a life filled with genuine affection, spontaneous laughter, and unburdened dreams. It was during one of these long, introspective nights that Nina found herself questioning the true nature of the arrangement. Despite the financial relief and the outward trappings of success, She could no longer ignore the hollowness that gnawed at her from within. Every public smile, every curt nod to an onlooker, felt like a mask that hid her true self. The more she performed for the world, the more she felt detached from the person she had once been. Memories of carefree days spent with her mother in sunlit gardens, of whispered confidences and shared dreams, now seemed like fragments of a distant past, a past that was steadily slipping away. A turning point came unexpectedly at a charity event held in a grand hall adorned with shimmering crystals and gilded accents. As Nina made her way through the crowd, she overheard a snippet of conversation between two influential guests. One remarked on how tragic it was that such a beautiful woman could be forced into a loveless arrangement, while the other speculated about the emotional cost of maintaining such a public image. Their words, though casual, struck a chord deep within her. For the first time in months, Nina allowed herself to acknowledge the profound loneliness that had settled in her heart. She realized that beneath the veneer of opulence and security lay a chasm of unmet emotional needs, a void that no amount of money or public admiration could ever fill. That night, after the event had ended and the last of the guests had departed, Nina wandered the quiet halls of her suite. In the reflection of a mirrored wall, she saw not the poised socialite that the world expected her to be, but a tired, uncertain woman haunted by the weight of her choices. The stark realization that her life was not truly her own, a life meticulously crafted by contracts and obligations, was both liberating and heartbreaking. In that solitary moment, she resolved to search for a way to reclaim a sense of self, even if it meant challenging the very terms of the arrangement. Meanwhile, Dominic too began to sense subtle shifts in the equilibrium of their union. In private moments when the demands of public appearances were temporarily set aside, he observed Nina's quiet introspection and the flicker of sadness in her eyes. For a man who had long mastered the art of detachment, these observations stirred something unfamiliar, a pang of regret, perhaps, for the life that might have been had circumstances been different. Yet, the rigid boundaries of their agreement left little room for emotional connection. The contract was clear, and any deviation from its terms would invite scrutiny from investors, family, and the public alike. In whispered conversations with a trusted confidant, a senior aide who had served the Ashford family for decades, Dominic expressed his inner conflict. "There are moments," he confided in low tones, "when I see the person behind the mask, and it reminds me that we are both prisoners of our own making." His words, spoken with rare vulnerability, were a secret shared in the darkness, a fleeting acknowledgement that even in arrangements designed purely for convenience, the human heart could not be entirely silenced. Nina's inner journey was fraught with moments of painful introspection. She began to keep a journal, scribbling down her thoughts in the dead hours of the night, when the weight of her reality became almost too unbearable. In those pages, she recorded not only the minutiae of daily events, but also the deep, resonant questions that had long been suppressed. Who was she beyond the role of a social wife? Could she ever find a way to reclaim the person she once was, even within the constraints of an arrangement that demanded constant sacrifice? The days turned into weeks, and the cracks in facade grew ever more pronounced. While the public marveled at the apparent perfection of the Ashford union, only Nina and Dominic could sense the underlying discord, a discord born of unmet desires, quiet sorrow, and the unspoken recognition that their lives were not truly their own. And so, in the private solitude of their respective worlds, both began to search for small acts of rebellion, a furtive glance of compassion, a shared moment of understanding, that hinted at the possibility of something more genuine than the sterile obligations they were forced to uphold. In the midst of it all, the media's relentless curiosity only added fuel to the fire. Rumors spread like wildfire, and every minor misstep was amplified, leaving Nina to wonder if the public would ever know the truth of the sacrifices behind the glittering facade. Each headline was a reminder that while their lives might appear picture-perfect, the cost of that perfection was a price paid in the currency of personal freedom and emotional fulfillment. As winter gave way to early spring, Nina's quiet act of defiance began to take shape in subtle ways. In moments when the cameras were not rolling, she allowed herself small expressions of authenticity, a soft smile shared with a stranger, a moment of genuine laughter with a friend. These stolen moments, though fleeting, rekindled a spark of hope that perhaps, one day, She might break free from the constraints of the contract and rediscover the vibrant self she had nearly lost. And though the road ahead was uncertain, the awareness of her own inner strength gave her the courage to face another day, no matter how many masks she was forced to wear. On a quiet evening, several months after the whirlwind of the wedding and the subsequent public performances, Nina found herself alone in the sanctuary of her luxurious suite. The city's lights shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the room with an otherworldly glow that both comforted and isolated her. In that solitude, as the hum of distant traffic mingled with the soft strains of melancholy piano, she finally allowed herself to reflect on the journey that had brought her here, a journey of sacrifice, obligation, and quiet resilience. The past months have been a relentless parade of public appearances, legal formalities, and carefully measured interactions. Yet now, as she sat curled in an armchair near the window, Nina considered the true cost of her newfound stability. The debt that had once threatened to suffocate her family was gone, replaced by a secure financial future and the promise of continuous care for her ailing mother. But in exchange for that security, she had forfeited a piece of her own soul, a piece that had long yearned for genuine connection, for a life filled with unbridled emotion and authenticity. As she leafed through the pages of her journal, each entry bore witness to the quiet battles she had fought in the solitude of the night. There were entries filled with hope and determination, and others that trembled with regret and sorrow. In those handwritten words, Nina found both the evidence of her own strength and the painful reminder of what had been lost. She recalled the faces of the people who had once known her as simply Nina, a daughter, a friend, a woman with dreams untainted by the demands of public life. Now, those memories were interwoven with the obligations of a role that had been thrust upon her by forces far beyond her control. In the reflective silence of her suite, Nina's mind wandered a man who had, in his own way, shared in this journey. Dominic Ashford, a man who, despite his polished exterior and unwavering professionalism, harbored secrets of loneliness and regret. Their partnership had been forged in the crucible of necessity, and while there had been fleeting moments of understanding between them, the unyielding constraints of their agreement had left little room for true intimacy. Yet, as Nina pondered the complexities of their union, she couldn't help but feel that perhaps both of them were, in some measure, prisoners of circumstance, each paying a price for a future that was promised but ultimately elusive. The memory of that fateful day in the courthouse, the quiet finality of signing away a piece of her future, returned to her with sharp clarity. It was a moment that had defined everything that came after, a moment when desperation met pragmatism and transformed into an unbreakable covenant. And while the contract had delivered her from the immediate threat of financial ruin, it had also bound her to a life of perpetual performance, a life where every smile was measured and every gesture was a calculated act of survival. As midnight approached and the city outside hushed into a tranquil lull, Nina allowed herself one final moment of vulnerability. With the gentle caress of the night breeze against her skin and the quiet reassurance of the distant stars, she made a silent vow to herself. The road ahead was uncertain, and the shadows of sacrifice would always linger at the edges of her consciousness. Yet, within those shadows, she resolved to seek out even the smallest sparks of authenticity, moments where the truth of her own heart could shine through the carefully constructed veneer of duty. In that reflective solitude, Nina recognized that her journey was far from over. The promise of financial security and the relief from overwhelming debt had come at a steep personal cost, a cost measured in lost dreams and quiet, unspoken longing. But as she gazed out the city, its myriad lights forming a tapestry of hope and possibility, she understood that perhaps there was still time to reclaim a part of herself. Even if the contract dictated the terms of her public existence, the private chambers of her heart remained a realm where she could nurture the fragile embers of who she once was. And so, as the night deepened and the soft strains of a piano lullaby filled the silence, Nina Hawkins sat with the weight of her memories and the promise of a future yet unwritten. In the interplay of light and shadow, of duty and desire, she found a quiet strength, a determination to continue walking a path defined not solely by obligation, but by the possibility of redemption. Though the scars of her sacrifices might never fully fade, they served as a testament to the resilience of a woman who had, against all odds, chosen hope over despair. In that solitary hour, As the world outside slumbered and dreams mingled with the silence, Nina embraced the duality of her existence. The contract, with all its legal precision and unyielding demands, had reshaped her life in ways she was still coming to understand. And while the public saw only a portrait of success and stability, in the quiet depth of her soul, a silent promise took root, that someday the true cost of her sacrifices might be repaid in the currency of freedom and authenticity. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the heavy curtains, painting the room with hues of soft gold and promise, Nina closed her journal. With a steadying breath and a heart both heavy and hopeful, she rose from her chair and prepared to face another day, a day in which the performance would continue, yet the quiet whispers of her own truth would no longer be entirely silenced. In that final, reflective moment, Nina knew that while the contract had delivered her from the precipice of ruin, it had also set her on a path where every step would be a careful negotiation between duty and desire. And though the future remained uncertain, the fragile spark of her own identity burned bright. A reminder that even in the darkest shadows of commitment, hope could still find a way to shine through. The winter's chill had given way to a hesitant early spring, and there came a subtle shift in Nina's inner world. Despite the daily routine of public events and meticulously rehearsed smiles, a slow-burning fire of discontent had begun to kindle within her. Every evening, as the city's neon glow seeped through the tall windows of her suite, Nina found herself restless, haunted by memories of who she once was and the dreams she'd nearly forgotten. One such night, after an exhausting charity gala, Nina lingered long after the last of the guests had departed. The echo of laughter and clinking glasses had faded into an oppressive silence, and in that stillness, the reality of her situation pressed upon her like an unyielding weight. With her journal open on the bedside table, she reread the raw confessions of earlier nights. The words told of her mounting doubts and a loneliness that had become an unwelcome companion. In a moment of clarity, she realized that every promise secured by the contract came with a hidden cost, a cost measured in the slow erosion of her identity. Unable to bear the solitude any longer, Nina sought out a confidant. The following afternoon, she met with Mara, an old friend from her past, a person who remembered Nina as a vibrant, independent soul. They met in a quiet corner of a small, sunlit cafe far from the prying eyes of high society. Over steaming cups of herbal tea, Mara listened intently as Nina recounted the cumulative toll of her marriage to Dominic. "I feel trapped, Mara," Nina whispered, her eyes reflecting both determination and despair. "I promised my mother I'd protect her, and I have, but at the same time, I'm losing myself. Every public appearance, every forced smile, chips away a little more of who I really am." Mara reached out, gently placing her hand over Nina's. "Nina, you deserve to live for yourself as well. This isn't just about keeping your mother safe. It's about reclaiming your own happiness. Sometimes a tipping point isn't the end. It's the moment you decide to change the narrative." The conversation ignited something in Nina, a resolve to confront the unsustainable nature of the contract. That very evening, as dusk deepened into night, she returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. The corridors of the penthouse, usually echoing with the silent routine of obligation, now vibrated with a raw energy of impending change. It wasn't long before the tension between duty and desire reached a critical mass. One quiet evening, after a long day of attending back-to-back public events, Nina found Dominic alone in the study, reviewing reports by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The atmosphere was charged, the space between them feeling suddenly less like a formal arrangement and more like a fragile truce on the brink of collapse. "Dominic," Nina began hesitantly, her voice low but insistent, "we need to talk, really talk, about what this arrangement is doing to both of us." Dominic looked up, momentarily taken aback by the earnest plea in her eyes. His voice, always measured, was softer now. "I understand there is a strain, Nina. Our roles have always been defined by necessity, but you seem different tonight." Nina took a deep breath, gathering courage. "Every day, I wake up feeling more like I'm wearing a mask. I appreciate the security you provided, the relief from the crushing debt, but I'm paying a price that I'm no longer willing to ignore. I feel like I'm losing myself in this performance." Is there no room to adjust the terms? No way to allow us a bit more authenticity? Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken sentiments. Dominic's eyes softened, betraying a glimpse of the man he once might have been before the weight of expectations hardened him. Our arrangement was never meant to be about love or emotional fulfillment, he replied slowly. But I see now that perhaps the toll it takes on you has been greater than anticipated. The conversation deepened, and for the first time, both Nina and Dominic allowed themselves a vulnerable dialogue. They spoke not only of contractual obligations, but of the unarticulated loneliness and regret that plagued them. Dominic revealed that beneath his carefully cultivated exterior lay a man who had long felt isolated, burdened by the relentless pursuit of public image that left little space for personal connection. Nina, in turn, confessed her deep-seated need to rediscover who she was, beyond the title of social wife. As the night wore on, the intensity of their exchange grew. In whispered tones, they deliberated the possibility of renegotiating the boundaries of their union. It was a dangerous proposition, one that could unsettle investors, invite the disapproval of their families, and shatter the delicate equilibrium of the public facade they had both so carefully maintained. Yet, in that quiet study, amid stacks of legal documents and the soft hum of distant traffic, a mutual understanding began to emerge. I cannot continue this charade without losing myself completely, Nina declared, her voice firm yet trembling with resolve. There has to be a way for us to salvage a piece of our true selves, even if it means challenging the very structure of what we've agreed to. Dominic leaned back in his chair, his eyes reflecting the gravity of her words. I have built my world on contracts and appearances, he admitted. But perhaps it's time we acknowledge that our lives are not defined solely by those agreements. If we are to endure, we must allow ourselves a possibility of change, even if that change is gradual and discreet. That night, as the city slept unaware of the private revolution unfolding behind closed doors, both realized that they had reached a turning point. Their pact, once a lifeline forged out of desperation, had become a crucible for transformation. In the interplay of vulnerability and pragmatism, the seeds of a more authentic future were sown. And though the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, the conversation marked the beginning of a tentative rebellion against the strict confines of their imposed roles. With the first blush of dawn, Nina awoke to a new day filled with a fragile hope. The internal shift she and Dominic had initiated the previous night echoed in every quiet moment, and as she dressed for the day, she felt lighter, if only slightly, than before. There was an unmistakable sense of possibility in the air, a promise that the path forward need not be a continuous cycle of sacrifice and suppression. Over the next few weeks, subtle changes began to materialize. In their public engagements, Nina allowed herself fleeting moments of genuine expression, a spontaneous smile here, a relaxed laugh there, small act of rebellion that hinted at a life reclaimed. She and Dominic, too, began to test the waters of their newfound understanding. At private dinners and low-key business luncheons, they exchanged candid observations about the demands of their public personas and the cost those demands had exacted. Their interactions, once dictated solely by the rigid terms of their contract, slowly assumed the cadence of real conversation. One evening, during a rare quiet dinner in the seclusion of a private dining room, Dominic slid a folded document across the table. I have drafted an amendment, he said quietly, his tone mingling formality with an unmistakable undercurrent of hope. It proposes adjustments, more room for personal discretion, a modest shift in our public commitments that might allow both of us to live with a little more authenticity. Nina's heart pounded as she carefully unfolded the document. The amendment was detailed, yet written in language that spoke of compromise and mutual respect rather than cold legalese. It suggested scheduled intervals of private time, opportunity for limited but genuine personal expression during social events, and even a clause that allowed for discrete moments of unscripted conversation between them, a small but significant crack in the armor of their facade. This is more than I ever expected, Nina murmured, her voice thick with emotion. It feels like we're finally being allowed to be human again. Dominic's gaze softened. We have spent so long confined by the roles expected of us. Nina, I believe that, with careful navigation, we can retain the protections we need while reclaiming fragments of ourselves. It may not please everyone in the public eye, but our happiness and our well-being should be worth the risk. In the ensuing weeks, they implemented the changes quietly. At a high-profile art exhibit, for instance, Nina allowed herself a moment of unguarded laughter as she admired provocative painting, her eyes alight with genuine delight rather than the practiced composure demanded by protocol. Observers noted a subtle warmth in her smile, a detail that, though minute, heralded the slow resurgence of her inner self. Meanwhile, Dominic began to exhibit a gentler demeanor in their private moments, his laughter less restrained and his eyes less guarded. As spring deepened into summer, the transformation in both their lives became increasingly evident. The media, ever watchful, began to remark on the apparent ease with which the couple now navigated social functions. Speculation circulated that something had shifted behind the scenes, a change in the dynamics of their relationship that made their public appearances seem less contrived and more genuine. While most observers interpreted this as a strategic rebranding, for Nina and Dominic, it was the first tangible taste of a life beyond rigid obligations. One late afternoon, after a quiet afternoon spent away from the relentless pace of public life, Nina stood on the balcony of their penthouse. The sky was a brilliant canvas of orange and lavender, and as she gazed out over the city, a sense of liberation filled her. In that reflective moment, she acknowledged that the path ahead would not be free of obstacles. The amendments, though promising, were only a start. Yet the horizon was unbound, a future no longer dictated solely by contract, but enriched by the possibility of genuine connection. In a softly lit conversation that evening, Nina and Dominic discussed their shared dreams beyond the boundaries of their current lives. "I want to see more of the world without feeling like I'm constantly on stage," Nina confessed. "I want to discover who I am when I'm not performing for an audience." Dominic, his voice imbued with a tenderness rarely revealed in public, nodded. "And I want to build a life where the measure of our success isn't just in the ledger of debts paid and contracts signed, but in the moments of joy and authenticity we create together." Their words, simple yet profound, carried the weight of transformation. They agreed to take small steps toward a future where each could pursue personal passions without undermining the security that had once seemed so essential. In the weeks that followed, they began to carve out private retreats, weekend getaways to quiet, secluded cabins, and evenings dedicated solely to honest conversation and unfiltered laughter. By the time summer yielded to a warm, golden autumn, Nina and Dominic had not only renegotiated the terms of their arrangement, but had redefined what it meant to live within it. Their lives, once a series of calculated appearances, now shimmered with the possibility of true human connection. The contract that had bound them in desperation had gradually loosened its grip, replaced by a mutual commitment to living more authentically, even if it meant challenging the strict expectations of high society. As the leaves turned and the days grew shorter, Nina looked forward to each new sunrise with cautious optimism. The journey had been arduous, filled with moments of both vulnerability and courage, but it ultimately led her to a space where she was free to be herself. In reclaiming her identity, she discovered that hope could indeed flourish in even the most unlikely of places. Standing on the threshold of a future unbound by past constraints, Nina embraced the truth that while the shadows of commitment might always linger at the edges, the light of unbound horizons was now hers to pursue. And in that radiant promise, both she and Dominic found not just a way to survive, but a way to live,